Hi, it's Toy Soldiers here. This time we're going to be doing a deck building science video here. We're talking about turn one playability and just how to go through your deck, how to actually evaluate what your turn one playability is, what your ideal turn one playability should be, depending on the type of character you're running, and we'll touch a little bit on early game, mid game, late game playability as well, but we won't go too deep into that this time around. But for this example, I'm going to be using my Bomb Man deck that I used in the last video. If you didn't watch it, you can go ahead and do that, or you don't really have to for this video. It's just kind of a good way to get familiar with the deck and the basic framework of UFS deck building. So turn one playability, for those of you who don't know, is basically on your opening 6 cards of your hand, how many of those cards are actually playable and how many of them are actually usable, or how many you actually want to have in your hand in the opening game. Because yeah, the deck that I'm currently holding in my hand has 41 foundations in it, it has 4 assets in it, and then 18 attacks. But just to say that, yeah, like the 41 foundations plus my 4 assets, that makes I have 45 cards in my deck that I want to play on turn 1. Well, no, that's actually not true. And if you go through your deck, you can kind of actually assess how many of which card you actually want and how many of them you can actually play. So I'll kind of give you an example to let you know what I mean. Let's take something simple, okay? Right off the hop, your attacks. Out of all these attacks, in my opening hand, I think the only one that I'd ever ideally want is a single copy of Leaf Shield. It's a 3 diff, so I have a chance of playing it on turn 1 if I really need to, or if I see a golden opportunity where my opponent built out their entire hand and I can poke with it, then I might want a Leaf Shield. Also, it's the most ideal block in my deck if I'm going to be building and keeping something in my hand. So out of all my attacks, turn 1 playable, I'd put 1 Leaf Shield out of my entire attack lineup. Getting into my assets, I'm running 4 homemade explosives, but I would never actually want to see more than one of them in my opening hand, because obviously building a bunch of homemade explosives, whereas it's really cool, isn't going to actually help me progress my game state too much in the first turn of the game. I'm going to be stuck with not having many foundations and still not being able to play as many cards as I want to. Getting into my foundation base now, the same sort of thing can be said about all your 3 difficulty foundations. Yeah, I've got 6 of them, but on my first turn, I'm probably never going to be able to realistically play more than one of them consistently. So out of all these cards, only one of them is actually turn 1 playable. Then going to the rest of my foundations, they should all be 1s and 2s, which are very well turn 1 playable. So this is going to be the bulk of your turn 1 playable, but out of those assets and those 3 diff foundations, you're actually only getting 1 card each. And then your attacks can sometimes be added to your turn 1 playable. So looking back at what we originally thought would have just been 18 cards is actually 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25 cards out of my deck that are not turn 1 playable. So now, if you look at this this ratio here, I think I'm playing around 63 cards. I don't know the math right off the top of my head, but you ideally, what you want for your turn 1 playable is you want just over 3 cards in your hand to be turn 1 playable. And I know just over 3 cards doesn't really make much sense, but you're looking like you try to go for like a 3.5 out of 6 cards in your deck that are turn 1 playable. So just over half. And if you look at this, I'm sitting at just over half in my turn 1 playable, right? Which is exactly where you're going to want it. Now, obviously, if you're a 7-hand sizer, you can play with those numbers a little bit more, because really what you need is you need to be able to play at least 3 cards in your opening turn to maintain a decent, board presence. And that's just like ideally for your standard UFS deck. There's obviously tons of exceptions to that rule because UFS is a really complicated game, but for the ideal thing, you want at least those 3 cards played. So I always say about 3.5 cards out of your character's hand size worth of turn 1 playable cards. And that's kind of how you want to design it. So then the opposite's going to go for 5 hand sizes, obviously, because the turn 1 playable stack is going to have to be much larger to ensure that your turn 1 builds are consistent. Because there's nothing that's going to suck than opening up with a handful of actions, assets, and attacks, only to mulligan and pull another handful of attacks. You never want to have that happen. You never want to be in a tournament situation where you just got a game loss simply because you didn't bother to look at what's actually buildable and playable in your opening turns. Because yeah, theoretically looking at it, your foundations, you might have a lot of 3 diff foundations that, just at a glance looks like you have lots of playable cards in the beginning, but those cards obviously can't just add to your turn 1 playability. And that's just something you really need to consider when you're building a deck. It's just, decent deck design, I guess. Just being mindful of those kind of numbers. Now, just to touch really quickly on early game, mid game, late game. So now, when I talk about early game, I'm talking about turn 2, turn 3, because turn 1's almost always spent building unless you have a deck specifically designed to do otherwise. So early game would be turn 2, 3, mid game would be like 4, 5, 6, and then late game would be like 7 plus. When you're getting close to your first exhaustion of your deck and you're doing your first remove from game, that's kind of where your late game starting in. And now different cards in your deck are, again, you can almost do a similar 2-pile system where you can look at what cards in your deck are actually going to be valuable at different stages in the game. So obviously once you hit the turn 2, turn 3, you can go back again through a bunch of your attacks and start saying, okay, even out of my attacks now, out of all my other cards, how many of these attacks do I actually want to see on the turn 2, 3? Because depending on the deck type that you have, you might not want to see a lot of these attacks on turn 2, 3. So then you can start going through and evaluating. You might, like if I didn't want to see Hyper Bomb until late game, then I wouldn't want to run 4 copies of it. Maybe I'd run 2 copies, because then I'd have, a longer time be able to pick up the single copy that I might need for my kill turn, come around turn 7 that I plan on playing it, right? But in this Bomb Man deck that I built, everything is very playable once you hit about turn 2, turn 3. So I run pretty high counts of everything. I run the 3 magnet pulls and the 3 leaf shields just as my chain enders. And then the reason why these cards are at a lower count is because I don't want to see leaf shield as often as I want to see the other ones, because I can't be as aggressive with leaf shields as I can be with everything else. And this card's also kind of my little Wally tech piece. And I don't really, as I get later and later into the game, the ability to block kind of gets easier for me because I have lots of card draw in this deck, and I have the ability to just kind of play around with what I can block with, so I don't really need that kind of block all that leaf shield is. So this card for me has strength in the early game, has strength in the mid game, and kind of peters out near the late game, right? Whereas Magnetic Pull is another kind of one of those cards where it's got lots of strength in the early game because it works as kind of a card loop. It's got decent strength in the mid game because it has a little bit of targeted committal on it when I can start putting damage on it. But then as I get to the late game, these both cards kind of just turn into string enders just to finish off my attack chain, which is why I can run 3 of each of them, and then they kind of fill that role for me come late game. And you can kind of go through your foundations and sort of do the same thing. One of the cards that I see people often playing tons of copies of is a card like Second Chance. And this is a card where at 1 copy, it's going to be really, really valuable at all stages of the game. But then once you start, well, not really at all stages, I should say in the beginning and mid game. Once you hit late game, Second Chance, usually you have a momentum already, and Second Chance just becomes this dead card that you're drawing into. It's not really powerful. It's not really going to add to your board state come turn 7. So I don't know why people ever run, this thing in high copies unless they're playing a really engine-based aggro deck. Because, yeah, and then even when you get 1 copy of this thing out on turn 2, if you draw another copy on turn 3, it's basically just this 1/5 useless blank foundation that doesn't even have a block on it. So that's the same kind of thing. If I had multiple copies in this, I could say that this would be playable turn 2, 3, and then the whole other copies would go into my big stack of crap that I don't want to see on turn 2, 3, along with my 6 or 7 diff finisher attacks or whatever else. So that's kind of your playability ratios in a nutshell. It's not really super complicated. It's not really that mind shattering, but it's just one of those things that if you be mindful of it when you're building your decks, you just go back through and double check, okay, when do I actually want to see my hyper bombs? Do I want to see them in mid game, early game, late game? Do I really justify running 4 copies of it? When is it good? Same thing with your homemade explosives. When do I want to see these? What effect does it have on my game state during the early game, mid game, late game? Do I want to see it in my opening hands? It's just, you always got to think about those kind of things whenever you're building a deck, right? That's a lot of the times why you're going to see me play one-ofs of things like Errands for Grandma, because it's an amazing card. But again, as I get into situations where I have a little bit better control of how I block and how I handle attack strings, Errands for Grandma might see a little bit less value. And also, it doesn't really play off that many different things, how often people are actually going to be throwing massive, powerful attacks at me. So I would never run more than 1 copy of this thing main board in a 6-hand sizer, and maybe I'd have them in the sideboard if I could see that value coming in later on. But this card would just become slightly, incredibly less value the more of them I had out, because that chance situation doesn't come up that often, and just having multiple copies out makes that chance situation, even less occurrent. It's not going to happen 3 times in 1 turn very often, at all. So having multiple copies of it out doesn't benefit me nearly as much as having, 1 Errands for Grandma, 1 Dauntless, and, anything else. That adds far more flexibility to my late game board state. So just weird little things to think about while you're building decks, while you're going through trying to tweak things and test things. Just constantly recognize, you know, do I really need multiple copies of Second Chance in this deck, or do I just focus on trying to play into getting my momentum a little bit better? A card like Trained by the Streets, you can almost value at 2 copies just because it does have that static block effect. It is a block as well. So it's a little bit of a card that you can kind of get the 2 copies out of. But again, I usually only run 1 copy of it because late game, when they have the ability to play around cards like this, then I almost do just want to see it as a block, and I don't want to have one in my staging area and then see one in my hand. I still want more cards that are going to add to my late game board state. And that when they stack on top of each other, they actually add value to each other. Kind of like S-Class Hunter. The more copies of this thing I get out, the more value I get out of them, right? Like, it's just a cumulative value. And that's also kind of how you have to evaluate things, right? Is that card going to cascade in value the more copies you get out, or is it really just going to sit there and not really do a whole lot of anything the more copies you get out? So that's kind of your build ratios in a nutshell. So I hope this video was helpful to some people. I know a lot of you watching this video are going to be like, well, duh, that's a lot of common sense. But, you know, when I was first starting out, I didn't even think twice about that kind of stuff. And I crammed in like 10-3 difficulty foundations and crap tons of assets and actions, and I was just clogging up and having to mulligan, you know, stuff that I thought was super valuable at the time away all the time. And yeah, it's just made things more cumbersome, right? So just balancing out your deck design, balancing out your builds, and making sure you get maximum value out of the cards you're putting in your deck. So yeah, until next time, this is Toy signing out.